Hello there, David Yellen. This is Glenn Loury at the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, and it's my great pleasure to welcome David Yellen, who's Dean of the Law School at Loyola University in Chicago. Hi, David.
Hi, Glenn. It's great to be with you. I've been a fan for a long time.
Oh, that's kind of you to say, David. I can't hear it enough, I'll tell you. But listen, enough about me. You're sitting there in Chicago, and the proverbial SHIT seems to have hit the fan over there. And I just thought it would be a really interesting thing and educational for me to hear from you here at Blogging Heads on the front lines, as you are, dean of a law school with a history of involvement in this kind of thing about what is going on.
Sorry, you're hearing my dog.
Yeah, I am.
I'm home right now. She should stop in a second.
I had a dog years ago. The dog is with my son now and lives in another city. But whenever I would do Blogging Heads at home, the dog would bark. Sometimes I'd have to get up from the table and go over and tend to the dog.
I think she probably knows that Bob Wright's dog has made a couple of appearances on.
Oh, she's jealous.
She's jealous.
She wants to be on camera. Anyway, I was just saying, here we are in the aftermath of the release of a video of Laquan McDonald being apparently, gunned down completely needlessly in the streets of Chicago. Looks very, very, very bad. A police officer has been indicted or charged in any case. You can clear up the legal thing. Protester in the streets. The mayor seems to be in political trouble. Police chief and other officials have resigned, and so on. And sort of want to hear your take about what's going on over there and what you think needs to happen.
Sure. It's kind of hard to know where to start, and I'll launch in, and please interrupt me anytime.
I will do.
Chicago has a rich heritage of police violence. You mentioned briefly that I've been involved in investigating another matter, John Burge, the most notorious police abuser in Chicago history. The city's paid out over $100 million in damages to people who he and his crew tortured when he was on the police force. Ironically, there's a real overlap between the Burge case and the Laquan McDonald case.
Oh, yeah?
Which is the day the city council approved the $5 million settlement to Laquan McDonald's family, before they'd even filed a lawsuit, which has gotten a lot of attention as a highly unusual action.
Yes.
Part of the reason I believe the city council didn't really pay a lot of attention to this settlement was that at the same meeting, they approved a $5.5 million reparations fund for victims of John Burge. So their attention was probably on this more notorious case of 25 years in the making.
Okay, so before we get to Laquan McDonald and to the current events, tell us a little bit about the John Burge case. I mean, I have read about this in the newspaper too, but many of our viewers may not know, just what went on.
Yeah, well, Burge was a police officer from the late 70s to till 1993. He worked on the south and west side of Chicago. He rose to the level of commander of detectives. And it came out that he and the officers working for him systematically tortured over 100 African-American suspects. And we're not talking about throwing them up against a wall, slapping them around a little bit. We're talking about homemade electrical devices being attached to their genitals and electric shocks being run through them. Bags being placed over their head and bringing them to the point of near suffocation and things like that. All of which were cleverly, quote unquote, designed not to really leave marks, but just to inflict great pain and terror. So there were stories about Burge for years, and the police department didn't act on it. And finally, in right around 1990, there was a notorious case of someone who had shot a couple of police officers who Burge and his crew beat to near death. So there was, evidence of old-fashioned abuse. And eventually Burge was suspended, in 91. He was fired in 93. But it was also, to the extent possible, it was swept under the rug. It wasn't until the 2000s, after the statute of limitations on his crimes had run, that an independent prosecutor was appointed and issued a very dramatic public report that all of this had happened.
This was unknown prior to that early 2000 event?
It wasn't unknown, but it was not, Burge had been fired in 93.
Yes.
The firing of a police commander was a big deal, but the city, tried to diminish how widespread it was, and of course made it out to be the one bad apple argument that we hear over and over again. There was no, they sort of quietly fired him. They didn't publicly acknowledge what he had done until over 10 years later after this independent investigation.
Let me just observe, correct me if I'm wrong. How could it be someone goes home and fashions an implement especially designed in order to be able to carry out this activity? That sounds like a whole lot of premeditated. I'll be looking for a culture. I want to know what these guys are saying to each other when they're drinking beer and what kind of stories they're telling to each other. I would presume that this is like the tip of an iceberg of some kind of pattern of behavior and set of attitudes and so on and so forth that couldn't just be limited to a single individual.
Well, obviously, back in 1990, you would have been completely unfit to be a mayor or a chief of police with that kind of attitude. The attitude of a mayor or chief of police would be, okay, we have to acknowledge this was a terrible situation, but it's a one-off. It's a bad apple. So there really, although there were lawyers and community activists and others who tried to make known what Burge was doing, and there were journalists who followed up, it never got currency beyond a very small pocket of Chicago.
I must say, $5.5 million of reparations doesn't sound like nearly enough if the amount of abusive behavior, such as you've just described, was as widespread as you say it was.
Yeah, it's not much money, but these are for the people who haven't yet had any remedy. Over $100 million of damages have been paid out to various victims when they have filed suit. The work I still doing, involves people who are still in prison after having been convicted based in part on confessions given to Burge, and haven't had a chance for real post-conviction review with the assistance of a lawyer since the official acknowledgement of the Burge-era torture.
How many people are we talking about?
Well, I've identified about 15 that are still in prison, and they'll now one of the heroes in this story is the now retired presiding judge of the Cook County Criminal Court, Paul Biebel, who appointed the special prosecutor who investigated Burge in the first place and appointed me to do this work regarding people still in prison.
Is there pushback? Is there any defense whatsoever being offered or any opposition to, trying to compensate or whatever? I'm just wondering what the discourse is like.
No. By the time this happened, by the time the $5.5 million was approved, that was the first time Mayor Emanuel really had occasion to vigorously apologize for the city's behavior. Of course, this happened 30 years before he was involved. So no, there was no pushback. There was just discussion of how much what Burge did reflected a broader police culture. Think about it too. So we have, because of Burge, there is something known as the Torture Inquiry Relief Commission that is still ongoing, and we have a reparations fund. It sounds like we've come out of apartheid or something, where we've had to set up these institutions to try and come up with corrective measures because of this unbelievable behavior by officers.
The only thing that's missing is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which would invite complicit officers to come forward under protection of limited or no further punishment to find out what the frigging is really going on over there.
Yeah, that's right. So the Burge case is ending, So there's this irony. The same day they approved the $5.5 million, they quietly approved the $5 million for Laquan McDonald's family. And
without a lawsuit having been filed, making you think that this is something like hush money. Again, I don't know what's going on over there, but it sure kind of looks like the motives might not have been altogether pure in appropriating those $5 million.
Well, I don't think you have to be, paranoid or conspiratorial to question in just that way. No lawsuit was filed. The video had been viewed by a very few number of people. Part of the agreement was that the family not release details about the video. Now, there was an ongoing criminal investigation, and Mayor Emanuel and State's Attorney Alvarez have said that this was proceeding in a normal way. But, I don't think anyone expected the investigation to take a year because it was such a simple case about indicting this officer. So whether they thought it would ultimately remain secret, I think that's probably not super likely, but they were certainly looking to minimize the public relations damage from this video that was out there.
Okay, so you have this background as a master, the court-appointed official in connection with the Berg matter. What's going on in the Laquan McDonald situation in terms of accountability for the police and for the mayor himself? What's happening over there?
Sure. So back in April is when this settlement payment was made to the family. It was right when Rahm Emanuel was in a runoff election, and there's speculation about the role that played in the decision making. After the settlement, the investigation, both state and federal, into the police dragged on, and eventually a journalist filed a Freedom of Information request to get the video, which the city vigorously opposed.
Okay, everyone knew a video existed and was not being made public. Okay.
Exactly. And this journalist eventually filed suit and won, and the judge in the case ordered that the video be released by Thanksgiving. And so that was the crescendo that led to all of these events. The video was released 2 days before Thanksgiving, and that's when the stuff hit the fan, because the video was an unambiguous situation of a cop shooting someone 16 times, including when he was on the ground, when he wasn't posing an imminent threat. And there were giant protests in the city immediately. And the city's first response was to be highly defensive. Mayor Emanuel said that, again, this is a one bad apple. We don't need any outside investigation of the police. This is all being handled. He appointed a review commission of highly qualified people, but they were people he chose and didn't, there's concerns about whether they have enough independence.
That have been appointed since the release of the video?
Yes, right around the same time. As I said, very respected people with lots of experience in prosecuting and law enforcement, and a public defender from the University of Chicago. So it's a really good group, but he no longer had the credibility for that to staunch the bleeding.
And I'm sorry to interrupt. The indictment was handed down before the video was released?
So, right. The investigation is creeping along, and then the judge orders the video to be released. Just before the court-ordered video release, he's indicted for first-degree murder. And Anita Alvarez says that this is just the way the process works, but there's not a lot of faith in that, because this isn't a very complicated case, frankly.
Right. Now, Alvarez, the district attorney there, is independent of the mayor, is she not? She's elected on her own account. She doesn't report to the mayor.
Correct.
So their offices are not supposed to be working in tandem with each other, or are they? Or it's Chicago, after all, I have to ask.
They're not. Yeah, I don't have a sense that they're either particularly close or at odds with one another. Now, she's in a closely contested race herself to retain her spot as state's attorney. The race was already thought to be very close because she hasn't had a great reputation on these type of matters in the community. So, she certainly has something at stake here in how this played out as well.
Alvarez, I'm drifting a little bit from the main course here, but I just want to ask, so that sounds like a Hispanic name to me. Does she have an identity as it were, a person of color, as a non-white person? Does she have a political cachet in that respect? And are there Black Latino politics issues at play here?
There are. She's a very prominent Latino woman. A successful prosecutor, is well established in the Latino community. Although I'll say a number of Latino leaders have been harshly critical of her since these recent events unfolded. Her main opponent in the state's attorney race is an African American woman. So there is that whole dynamic going on as well.
I see. When is that reelection for her coming up?
That's in March or April.
I see.
So that's going to be an interesting situation as well.
I want to ask you about releasing the video. Theoretically, I could see a case being made on behalf of public safety about why a video like that, why somebody wouldn't want it to come out, quite apart from, whatever the political calculation might be. Just that, look, there's due process. The officer is being investigated, now has been indicted. People are going to see this video and they're going to hit the streets, and we don't want a Baltimore, we don't want a Ferguson, whatever. Is that at all creditable? I'm just hypothetically advancing what a counter-argument might look like.
Yeah, there's two arguments that you're raising there. One is public safety, the other is due process. And I think they both potentially argue for a brief delay in releasing this kind of video. When someone is under investigation, you don't want to prejudice the decision about whether or not to indict that person, and a public uproar can be a factor in that. And also public safety, in that not wanting to incite, riots is, I guess, the way the police authorities would say what they're worried about. But again, at most, I think those argue for a brief delay. This went on for a year.
Yeah. Okay, so the police commissioner, McCarthy, is out.
Yeah, so let me take you through a few more events.
Please do. Yeah.
So Officer Van Dyke is indicted on first-degree murder.
Yeah.
The video is released. The giant protests in the city. Black Friday shopping is brought to a virtual halt on Michigan Avenue.
Wow.
And Mayor Emanuel vigorously defends Gary McCarthy and the investigation and opposes any federal investigation. Within a few days of that, that was just right before Thanksgiving. We're 2 weeks out now. Mm-hmm. He changes his mind on all of those things. McCarthy is fired. Mayor Emanuel embraces and now is enthusiastically supporting a federal investigation. And other high-ranking officials have left too. The chief of detectives has kind of abruptly retired, and the head of the Independent Police Review Board has also left.
Now, are these individuals, the police commissioner, the chief detective, etc., personally implicated in some way in these bad deeds that have gone down?
The chief of detectives, as far as I know, was not implicated in any way in this, although there may be some issues with some other cases. I mean, neither John Burge nor John Van Dyke are the only police officers who have hurt or killed Chicago citizens in recent years, and there's lots of other cases, lots of other investigations. Gary McCarthy as the head of the police department, the mayor wasn't going to lose his job over this. It's kind of like in sports when the team really doing badly.
You fire the manager.
Yeah, the owner's not going to get fired.
Right.
Sometimes the GM, more often the coach or manager. So McCarthy was sacrificed to to Emanuel's needs and the hope for a better time going forward. The Independent Police Review Board, that person had nothing to do with this per se, but that's an agency that has been very troubled because it doesn't have enough authority. It isn't independent enough. And that really, this will come out as part of this federal investigation. It needs to be reconstituted as something that's more independent of the government and has more teeth.
I see. Now, my friend Harold Pollack there at the University of Chicago has written recently that he liked McCarthy and thought he was, on the whole, a pretty good guy caught up in a bad situation. Does that have this ring of truth to you?
McCarthy, when he came to Chicago, certainly had the reputation as a modern, reform-minded police leader. We have a generation of police leaders today, sort of starting with William Bratton in New York and Ray Kelly, who've done a lot of good things in big city police departments. And there were high expectations that McCarthy would be one of them. And some of the things he did, I think, were really quite good. But this issue, so we have two things. First of all, there's so much violence in poor communities in Chicago.
Yeah.
And that's not McCarthy's fault, but that's the background that you can't escape being here in Chicago. And then second, this problem of police violence and killings, as it gathered steam, he was not a courageous leader in saying, basically, we have failed, we need help.
You just mentioned the Chirac problem, Spike Lee's new movie. And every time, and I do from time to time, turn on Fox News just to see what they're talking about. They're raving and ranting about black on black, violence, and Chicago is the case in point, leading case in point. And I must say, my son Alden Keith Loury and his wife and 3 children live in Chicago. And he lives out there on the south side, right in the midst of some of what's been going on, where this poor little kid, 9 years old or whatever.
Yeah.
That kid played and was lured away from a park where my son had been playing Little League Baseball, 35 years ago. And he's never wanted to move out of the neighborhood. He's a professional. His wife is a professional. They can afford to live in the suburbs. But they've always been proud of being a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. And, they're kind of getting pushed to the wall. They're becoming disillusioned. They're wondering, and they got to think about their safety and the safety of their family and things like that. And I'm saying all of that to ask, maybe it's unfair to ask this of you, but what's, if any, the connection between those conditions of, urban violence, which have deep roots, historical, sociological, and whatnot. One could go into it. I'm not asking you to do that. I'm asking you to connect that to policing. If there's any legitimate, please, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not trying to defend the ill deeds of police officers. I'm trying to figure out what it does to the culture of policing to be operating in such an environment, sweeping up the mess, as it were, confronting the dead bodies, going into circumstances day in and day out, week in and week out, where you can't know whether or not you're going to be confronting armed people, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think about that?
Well, those are big questions, of course. I think it's important to remember a couple of things. The crime rate in the country is dramatically lower than it was when your son was playing Little League in that park 30 years ago.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Oh, sure.
Crime. But I guess that's true everywhere, so it's relative.
It's true everywhere.
Yeah.
The drop in crime in Chicago has been a lot less than the drop in crime in a number of other big cities like New York.
Yeah.
Even so, the murder rate in Chicago is lower today than it was in 1970. It's too high. It's higher than in cities like New York. And it's become so isolated in the most ravaged communities. That's where the Chirac thing comes in.
Mm-hmm.
If you spend your time in large swaths of Chicago, you see a modern, exciting, dynamic, safe city. But if you're growing up in the worst pockets of the city, in terms of safety, things are worse than ever. And so if you're a police officer in those communities, that has to contribute to the us versus them mentality that is so damaging to the kind of police community relations that are necessary, for effective policing.
Do police officers, many of them, live in the city of Chicago?
Yeah, they're I believe required to live.
Oh, they are required to live in the city of Chicago.
But not, you can imagine that not many of them live in the most high crime neighborhoods.
And what is the racial composition of the police force in Chicago? 13,000? Is that the right number? I was told something like that.
Yeah, I think somewhere around 25% or 20% of the force are African American. So way more representative than a couple of generations ago. Not as representative as not representative of the population, but more so than it was in another generation.
Are they, that is, the police officers of color, if I can use that term, the black police officers more pointedly, speaking out in any way? Do they have any kind of caucus or any kind of collective voice in addressing these matters?
There is an association, and they've spoken out some. There are some calls now, for the next police commissioner to be a person of color, but not in an aggressive way. The problem with police abuse crosses racial lines as well. There's another trial going on right now of an African American commander who has a record as long as your arm of complaints of violence. And on this occasion that led him to be prosecuted, he apparently stuck a gun so far down the throat of a suspect that it caused serious damage to their throat. He's on trial right now for assault. So, this stuff comes in all forms, and it really requires a root to branch assessment of recruiting, training, assessing, monitoring of police behavior.
I'm just stunned over here. Not so much that an incident like sticking a gun in someone's throat so aggressively that you injure them is hard for me to fathom. I can see that. But what is stunning me, again, is that this has just got to be the stuff that's above the water level, and there's just got to be a whole mountain that's underneath. Where does that attitude gestate? I mean, that behavior is the manifestation of an outlook on policing and an outlook on the people that you're dealing with. So it would seem to me, I'm speculating over here in the comfort of my, very safe environment. But I'm just wondering, my God, who are these people? What do they say to each other when nobody has got a microphone underneath them? And, where does that kind of attitude come from?
Well, of course, the sort of million-dollar questions are, what percentage of the police force is bad? And how does that compare Chicago to other cities? And hopefully some of these investigations that are now underway will put some more context in that. Like in any city, there's so many really fine police officers. I know plenty of current and former police officers. Some of them become law students at my school. Some of them work in security for the university. I've had a couple of really powerful conversations with African American campus police who used to be city police. And they're just torn apart at this because they went into policing for all the right reasons. And they knew some of this stuff was going on. And what do you do as a low-level police officer in these circumstances? It does seem to be the case that among the major cities in this country, Chicago has one of the worst cultures in in regards to police violence. New York did although there are plenty of bad things that happened in New York, Eric Garner, but in general, New York has a much better reputation than Chicago. LA was pretty bad back in the Rodney King era, but after a federal investigation, they made very significant progress in improving policing and community relations. Chicago's been a laggard in that regard.
Yeah. I just want to press this point a little bit, though. You say bad police officers. I'm not attributing any particular theory to you, but there is a theory in which you have bad apples, you get them out, you weed them out, you screen properly, you psychologically test, whatever, you get the bad guys out. That's one kind of theory, which makes it a kind of individualized problem of bad people. But I'm just wondering if that theory is adequate to the task of accounting for what we observe, in the sense that, a person could come in perfectly good, quote unquote, and become bad, quote unquote, just by being embedded in a culture. And moreover, a person may not himself be, quote, bad, close quote, but may in some solidaristic way support or abet or cover for or whatever the others who are. And so we have a systemic problem, not a identify individual deviants and weed them out problem.
And to his belated credit, today Rahm Emanuel was for the first time acknowledging that this isn't just individual officers, that there is a systemic problem. The forever and ever it's been, that's a bad apple. What I've been saying lately is, you get enough bad apples and it's time to look at the root and branches of the tree. And
that's what I'm saying.
Look, police departments have cultures.
Yeah.
Every organization in society has a culture. Police departments more than most because of the intense nature of the relationships. Yeah. And there are different cultures within police departments from city to city. So I don't think it's being unfair to say that the evidence is there that Chicago's police culture over a long period of time has been much too tolerant of abuses of people's rights.
There's a local investigation and a federal investigation. What should we expect to come out of these investigations? What are they investigating?
Well, the group that Mayor Emanuel appointed is charged with looking at sort of everything from soup to nuts in police-community relations, from recruiting, hiring, training, oversight, all of that. The federal investigation, the authority for this comes out of a statute passed by Congress after the Rodney King case, which authorizes the Department of Justice to investigate whether a police department is engaged in a pattern or practice of deprivation of federal civil rights. And they've investigated dozens of city police departments around the country in the 20 years since then. So the local investigation will be more focused on corrective measures. The federal investigation will probably be more looking into assigning blame to some extent, but also what very often happens coming out of these federal investigations is ultimately a consent decree where the Department of Justice and the local authorities agree to anything from training programs to the appointment of an outside monitor who gets to oversee much of the police department for a period of time. So I think with both of these things going on and the climate right now, there's going to be a more serious look and probably more change in the Chicago police community than has ever happened before.
That sounds like a good thing. I'm wondering here what the legal basis is for federal. Is it a civil rights? Is that how you get the federal government involved in the local affairs of a police department?
Right, because the federal government doesn't investigate and prosecute local crime. But something like this, there's a federal investigation ongoing of Officer Van Dyke. So he may be also charged with a federal civil rights violation. That's an individual prosecution. But this systemic examination is exactly that also. Is the police department systemically violating citizens' constitutional rights?
Okay, maybe we can circle back to Laquan McDonald. You say protests are still ongoing. What's the nature of that?
Yeah, there was a big crowd outside of City Hall this morning when Mayor Emanuel made his speech. There are other rallies and protests going on every day in the city. They're calling for Mayor Emanuel to resign. He's not going to do that. They're calling for Anita Alvarez to resign. She's not going to do that. So the protests have done an awful lot of good. Without thousands of people making their voices known, this wouldn't be playing out the same way. But eventually, I think the protests will begin to die down because that's what always happens with protests. But whether Emanuel has a future as mayor of Chicago after he was just reelected, so he's got 3.5 more years, that's a lifetime in political terms. So who knows what's going to happen there.
I got to ask you a pointed political question, which is his reelection legitimate in virtue of the fact that what the public knew about this event and what he knew about it were not in sync with one another, and there's a feeling of manipulating information in order to affect an election? Just asking.
Yeah, I'll tell you something really interesting. There's a woman in Chicago named Karen Lewis. She's the head of the teachers union.
Yeah.
And she and Mayor Emanuel have bumped heads,
I'm sure,
dramatically.
Right.
And there was a time when she was publicly thinking about running for mayor. And then she developed a brain tumor and didn't run. She would have been extremely formidable based on the dynamic in the city at that time. She just said today or yesterday that she thinks that if Emanuel, the city had released the video back in April, he still would have won re-election because he would have gotten some credit at the time for transparency had he done sort of the right thing at that time. I thought that was a really interesting take. So, is his reelection legitimate? Well, in a legal sense, absolutely. In a political sense, he's at 18% approval rating right now. So I think that answers that question, at least for the moment. He's about as tenacious a human being as you'll ever meet. So I wouldn't count him out. If Anita Alvarez loses to Kim Foxx, I'm sure the mayor will greet her with open arms again as a way to build bridges. Look, I have to say, as horrible as this stuff is, I'm optimistic that it actually is going to lead to improvements because with an embedded 100-year problem like this, there was no way to get the establishment to pay attention to these problems short of a major crisis. And we have that major crisis. And we'll see whether, as Rahm likes to say, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. We'll see if that happens here.
Okay. Listen, this is a natural stopping point, but I want to ask you if there's something else you want to say about what's going on over there that hasn't been said so far.
Well, I just want to mention, this obviously has ramifications around the country. And one of the things that also just happened is that the FBI just announced that for the first time, they're going to establish a good database on police killings. Up till now, there have been no good official statistics. There are some outside organizations like the Guardian newspaper in England, which has worked very hard to gather numbers which show, as many people are killed in a U.S. city by the police in a month as are in 10 years in England or something like that.
Yeah.
That data has been really lacking, and the absence of data, as you know, just leads to bad policy decisions and choices. So again, I think it's terrible what's led to this, but I think it's great that the problems of police abuse are on the national agenda in a way that they never were before. And, then ultimately we can also focus on the problems that the police face every day in fighting the terrible violence in the most damaged parts of our inner cities.
So I didn't say the word race. I don't believe at any point in our dialogue it perhaps seemed superfluous, unnecessary to say because it suffuses every corner of this discussion. are there working class white neighborhoods in Chicago that have crime in them where the police are observed to do anything like what they're seen to be doing in the south side and the west side of the city? Not really.
Not really. John Burge, the 100+ known torture victims, I think every one of them was an African American. Now, he was working in neighborhoods that were overwhelmingly African American. But there aren't the white lower socioeconomic class neighborhoods in Chicago neither have as much violent crime as the black neighborhoods, nor do they have this intense police presence and us versus them thing going on. So again, for the people in those communities, they get the worst of both worlds. I meet any number of young people who come visit our school who are in enrichment programs in their school. And as I look at them and talk to them, they're dodging bullets to get an education. And then they have to worry about being in the wrong place and having the police kill them. It's our national shame.
Yeah. Well, Black Lives Matter. I think we can both agree about that. And, I'm one of those people who has wanted to say, yes, Black Lives Matter, but all lives matter. And I think the emphasis on the black might not be politically constructive if we're trying to get a coalition together of people to change a system. But, it's just hard not to watch that video of Laquan McDonald being bulleted while he lay on the ground and not think, what a contempt must be in the minds not only of the shooter, but of those who are sitting idly by, those police officers who are observing the event take place and apparently have nothing to say about it after the fact except closing ranks and circling the wagons. God, what do they think about the people whom they are policing? And how can a police department ultimately be effective? How can it win the confidence of the citizens and their cooperation in maintaining public safety if they exude such contempt for the lives of the people who they serve? They're supposed to be serving and protecting these people.
Well, and Glenn, that's why I disagree with you that all lives matter is an appropriate slogan in this time. I get some of your points. I've watched every dialogue you and John McWhorter have done, and
thank you.
I love hearing your thoughts and how they evolve and change. But look, Black Lives Matter is powerful because black lives are way more at risk than white lives. Sure, all lives matter, but as a white person in society, you face a dramatically lower risk of violence at the hands of criminals or violence at the hands of the police than do African Americans. So I think it's appropriate that there be a focus on this most at-risk group. So that's why I support not everything Black Lives Matter is doing and saying, but the basic gist of it. And I think most people who say all lives matters in response to Black Lives Matters are really trying to evade societal responsibility for a problem that we haven't owned yet.
Sure, not this person, but most people, sure.
I was thinking more in the political realm.
Okay, so you invite this this question. I'm going to ask it. How ought, in light of the fact that you think Black Lives Matter is the right way of framing it because Black lives are at greater risk, that movement deal with the victimization side of this pincer in which the people in these communities are caught? Both the police treating them with contempt and disregarding their civil rights, and the risk of being victimized. How would a movement that means to bring to public attention the ill behavior of the police grapple with, articulate their equal, or if not equal, their revulsion and their opposition to the other side of the risk to the black lives that coming from bad actors within their own communities?
Yeah, well, of course, there are tons of individuals and groups in Chicago and in other cities who are doing exactly that kind of work in their communities. They tend not to get the same headlines that lots of other people get. But, you know, it's a dangerous myth in some quarters that the black community, you know, just circles the wagons and doesn't attack internally the dynamic that leads so many, young black inner city men to drugs and guns and gangs. There's lots of work being done. What there isn't is lots of leaders calling out in a loud national way that problem in the same way that they do the official misconduct, like in the police cases. To some extent, I think that's understandable on two levels. First of all, it's a lot easier to focus your attention on responsible actors in charge of organizations than a diffuse group of individuals. And second, there's an understandable defensiveness that if we're not getting the resources we need for our community, why am I going to add my voices to those criticizing the morals of my community? But a lot of people, in the communities who are not shouting in that way are still working really hard to try and stop young men from getting involved in that kind of stuff and change some of the family dynamics that contributes to.
So I'm no expert on these deep sociological issues.
Well, David Yellen, Dean of the Law School at Loyola University in Chicago, thanks for that last bit, too. I think there is a needed corrective to the Glenn Loury shtick embedded in there somewhere, and I'm going to see if I can't learn from it. Really appreciate your time this morning. Thanks so much, okay?
Thank you, Glenn.
Okay, bye-bye.